Greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, and tonight we're shining a light not on something specifically in South Africa, but rather a global issue. And you're going to hear the word global, I think, quite a bit in tonight's discussion. And tonight to join me for this discussion is Hügo Krüger. He's a South African structural engineer who currently resides in France. And we're going to be talking about, if the title hasn't been enough of a clue, the green revolution, nuclear energy, climate change, wind and solar power, technocracy, fuel poverty, sustainable, effective energy solutions, and much more. So welcome on the show, Hügo. It's not your first time, but I hope this conversation is also as insightful as the first.
Oh, well, thank you, Ernst, for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
So I think to start off, you're a structural engineer, but where does your interest in all this green energy and, well, the whole climate debate and everything surrounding it come from? Where did this start?
So I have to quantify my profession because people have been misrepresenting it, not in bad faith on the internet. I'm a structural engineer, but I did my master's in nuclear power. Okay, so I understand how to build nuclear reactors, how they operate, how nuclear energy works. I understand more or less the physics of it, but I'm not a nuclear scientist. I'm not a nuclear engineer. So some people have said nuclear engineer. That's wrong. I'm a structural engineer, and I specialize in building nuclear structures. Right. So that's the first point on it. The second one is I work on energy projects. So I've worked at ITER, the International Fusion Nuclear Fusion Reactor, which is nuclear fusion. I've worked on Hinkley Point, which is a fission plant. And I've worked on offshore wind farms of all things, and I've worked on the Arctic LNG, so liquefied natural gas. So I've been all over the energy sector, ranging from responsibilities of designing the structure to managing teams doing the design. So managing interdisciplinary teams. You work with structural engineers, you work with economists, you work with electrical engineers. There's lots of aspects going into a complex project. At ITER, we built a beryllium treating facility, so we needed an expert in beryllium treatment to try and understand how the building works, for example. So I started looking into these projects, and the more you're into the energy sector, the more you realize how political it is. I don't think there's another sector of the economy that's as political. And why is that? Energy is one of the three elixirs of life. So you need water, you need food, and you need electricity to make human civilization work. So from that perspective, I always say the best perspective to look at it is through old school developmental economics. So humans discovered fire, and fire allowed us to eat meat, that allowed our brains to develop. But at the same time, we discovered energy. And since the Industrial Revolution, essentially what we've done, we've replaced muscle with energy. So we had coal as the first source of energy using the blast furnace. We were allowed to melt iron into steel. And as time went on, we moved to energy-dense solutions. So coal, we found oil, we found nuclear energy, and today you've got solar and wind all over the place. So these are all sources of energy that allows us to do production. And the more energy per person, and this is empirically proven, or at least there's a not a causal relationship, a correlative relationship between energy and GDP per capita. So if you look at the amount of electricity a country has, to make it simple, the amount of barrels of equivalent oil a country has, the richer the country is. So the country with the most amount of energy available in the world is the United States. China is very close to that, but per person, China is not very high. Europe's got a high level of energy per person. So the point is that we all think in South Africa in terms of free markets. We don't think in terms of the national democratic revolution, which is neither national democratic or revolutionary. But none of these wise ideas will work if the basic fundamentals of infrastructure is not there, and that comes down to energy, water, food, transport, these basic things. So I started looking at it through that lens, and then you realize throughout Europe. There's something funny that's happening, that European fuel poverty has been in the increase for the last 10 years, for example. There's other reasons what is happening, and you would think that is strange.
Maybe before you continue, what is fuel poverty for
Okay,
those who don't know?
so fuel poverty takes different definitions in different countries, but in Germany, it comes down to spending about more than 10 to 15% of your income on electricity and on energy. Okay, so in other words, if you take your salary and you pay the rent, and you can just drive to work, and you can just put the lights off, and in Europe heat your house. If your entire income covers only that, you're essentially in fuel poverty. If you've got more, you're out of fuel poverty. Okay, that also food is included. So if your basics, including fuel, is there. And what you're finding in Europe now is, I think the last statistics I look at, it's something like 50 million Europeans do not have enough money sometimes during the winter to heat their homes. Okay, and this has been on the increase in Europe. And there's a very interesting institute of fuel poverty for the European Union. And the question is, why is this happening? Why is it that one of the richest continents in the world is creating poverty? We should, you should have this conversation. Why is it that in the United States, generally fuel poverty has been only decreased, except in California? California has been increasing. Why is it that people are migrating from California to Texas, for example? Okay, I don't know if they're going to migrate now because of the blackouts, but generally they were migrating before the trend. And what you find is that people tend to migrate where there's economic opportunity. And I put it that one of the markers of economic opportunity is access to electricity. Okay, so we have to ask, why did California lose its niche, if you will? And I put it that one of the reasons they've done it is because they've listened to the environmentalists, and in the process of chasing carbon dioxide, they have actually increased poverty. Because when you don't focus on eliminating poverty, you only focus on eliminating emissions. You're actually telling people, I'm going to limit the amount of energy you've got access to, and that's going to increase poverty.
Hmm. Well, doesn't sound like the type of rhetoric we're getting from the more environmentalist side of the commentariat. We're getting the rhetoric that's, no, this is improving people's lives. Things are getting cheaper because of it. We're hearing all types of living standard improving rhetoric from them. But what you're describing here seems like completely the opposite. Why don't we hear this type of analysis more frequently and from more established voices?
It's something I've been asking myself. So first is we need to see what we're up against here. In the United States and in Europe in particular, there's a very strong environmental movement. Now, they've got different historical roots. In the United States, they come generally from California and the universities there. There was an interesting guy called Paul Ehrlich who wrote a book, The Population Bomb, in the 1970s. And he said by the year 2000, we're basically going to overpopulate the earth. That never happened. Okay. In Europe, there's even ideas of vegetarianism going back all the way to the Third Reich, where the Nazis actually passed very strict animal protection laws. So it's a very authoritarian nature in Europe. But I would say modern environmentalists are not fascists or anything of the sort, right? There are people who want to try and protect the environment. Now, the problem with that statement is that what do you mean when you say you want to protect the environment? Does that mean you're not allowed to develop anything that is going to, not allowed to develop your resources, for example? Does it mean that you're not allowed to make people prosper in the same sense? In other words, am I going to limit or ration your resources? Okay. And in the process, protect the environment. And if your marker for prosperity is only environmental protection and not fuel poverty and not all these other things, then you can easily come to the conclusion that, hey, I'm saving the environment and I'm making your life better, even though I'm putting you into poverty.
Hmm. Well, what you're describing there is the religion of green, a term that I heard you were talking about with Dumu Denga on his podcast. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? Because that is the title of this episode, and it is a term that I'm seeing more and more. Maybe just give a little bit of a conceptualization there.
So yeah, I call it the green religion, and the reason I say it's a religion, because as soon as you're dealing with rhetoric and not facts, you're dealing essentially with theology. So whenever somebody has a vision of changing the world, for example, and you ask him, okay, how practical and sensible is your vision, how enforceable it is, and he hasn't thought that through, he's essentially got a religion of sort. So I would say modern day environmentalism is a modern religion. Now, it's interesting thing that in Europe, generally Christianity has been in decline for the last century, and so has communism and socialism. In fact, all utopian fantasies failed in Europe, whether it's fascism, whether it's communism, whether I would say even Christianity is, collapse after the First World War, for example. And what you find is that the people who are now in the ruling elites in the United States and Europe have got almost a dedicated zeal to protect the environment. And they're acting as if it's a religion. So the 10 Commandments has now been replaced with check your carbon footprint, for example. It's that type of thing that you're dealing with. And the thing that they're doing is they're looking at every problem in the world through the lens of environmentalism. Almost like the woke theory, how they can only see race in everything. these people are seeing carbon and sustainability in everything. And you can look at companies nowadays. Philip Morris is my most favorite, where Philip Morris sells cigarettes. Okay, now you'd think cigarettes would be generally bad for human health and the environment, but Philip Morris is ranked in the top five sustainable companies. So you'd ask yourself, how is smoking good for the environment, right? But you can come to that conclusion if they have all their factories powered by solar panels, for example. Then I'm sure the cigarettes are good for the environment. So Philip Morris is reducing its carbon emissions, but it's still causing cancer. Okay, but it's good for the environment.
What's funny
Yes.
about when you mentioned there that these people are looking for carbon everywhere, I mean, that's not a challenge when you're living on Earth and when you yourself are made out of carbon. It's one of the easiest things. If you are able to demonize pretty much carbon, then you can find. It's like that old saying of if you're looking for the devil, you'll find him. Well, if you're looking for carbon, you'll find it everywhere, and it's not
Well,
even.
that's the stupidity of this thing to me, is that we are on a carbon-based planet. Now, basic chemistry is carbon is the sixth element on the periodic table. Carbon binds to everything. Okay, this is the advantage of carbon. So you've got carbon isotopes, everything. You've got carbon molecules everywhere. In factually every industrial process that you do, you're going to release carbon dioxide. So your roads are built out of bitumen. When the US they say asphalt. How do you make that? That's a byproduct of oil. How do you make cement? Well, you take limestone, which is calcium oxide, you burn it, and you've got carbon dioxide that released in the process. How do you make, what is wood made of? Well, wood is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen generally, and it's got some kind of combination in it. It's anything from the toilet paper to paper, plastic, for example, polyvinyl chloride. In the process, you can release carbon dioxide. So you can try and limit carbon dioxide and carbon emissions, and maybe there's an argument in electricity to do so. But is it really sensible, even plausible, to do it for all industrial processes? And the answer to that, in my view, is actually no, you can't. You can try and limit it if you really want to, if that is your only goal in life. But at the end of the day, we have to live. So we have to accept a certain limit of emissions and pollution. And this is where the green religion gets very interesting to me, is that there was a Swedish guy called Budden, I think it was, and he realized very early on that if you control emissions, you can control humans, because I can control the amount of CO2 you're emitting. I essentially control the amount of electricity you've got, the amount of water will be somewhere related in the process, and I can basically ration your standard of living. So it comes back to an old argument of Malthusianism. Malthus was the economist who said we're going to run out of food because the population is exploding exponentially, and he didn't take into account the the actual green revolution, which was the agricultural revolution, which we discovered nitrogen, and because of nitrogen, it allowed us to build crops. We were allowed to use crops in cross-season seasoning of crops, and essentially nowadays we've got more food available than ever. We've actually got more resources available than ever, and we've got more people than ever. So Malthus was proven wrong by history. But if you ask the green people, they say no, we're destroying the planet. The facts are actually against them. We're not destroying the planet. We're actually saving the planet while we are developing.
But when you mention that, I just think instantly of how all the great economies on Earth were built. They were pretty much built by coal engines and by pumping the air full of carbon and polluting
Well, I
the
mean,
environment.
you've got two materials that every structural engineer has to use, and every structure around you is made out of them, more or less. Maybe a third one. It's cement and it's steel. What is steel? Steel is iron. It's carbonized iron. Okay, iron carbide, I think, is what do you call it? Potaster, cast iron. You've got cement, which is just a derivative of that thing. And look around you. How much cement and steel do you see? It's everywhere. It's in the wall just behind you, for example. Or you can make your house out of wood, which is deforestation. So you're going to chop down trees, which is taking carbon dioxide out and producing oxygen. So this religious mission to try and chase away every little bit of carbon dioxide, in my view, is just ridiculous. And I really think it's a religion, because factually all companies are adapting it. In South Africa, Standard Bank is no longer going to fund, or the Standard Bank is going to use in their metrics for funding sustainability index. The Bank of England CEO Mike Carney and Goldman Sachs CEO is proposing a carbon exchange mechanism, meaning every transaction you're going to do, you're going to look at the carbon, and we're going to tax you for the amount of carbon dioxide in the product.
And we see that in South Africa as well. I mean, I mentioned that in my episode where I talked about the ANC cargo cult, and you can see that with the carbon tax in South Africa. Now, we are struggling to keep the lights on. We have rolling blackouts. The majority of our energy is created through coal, and
And we're
now
going
we're
to tax
putting a tax on it.
So
So,
yeah, but there's a danger to this because here in France in 2018, I think it's 18 or 17. Anyway, we had the Gilets Jaunes riots, which was Monsieur Macron, in his wisdom, thought that he was going to fund the renewable energy products of EDF, which didn't make money at the time, through a carbon tax. So the idea was to increase a little bit the tax on diesel, and before you knew it, you had riots in the street, and I think 15 people were killed. So if you touch people's energy, and this is the way things get dangerous, and if you increase energy access, you are playing with fire. And we can see it in South Africa as well. What is the distinction between a poor and a rich South African? Essentially, it's access to energy. Whether it's access to driving a car, transport, that's energy, or whether it's having electricity. Okay, so I don't like that type of metric. So now, in terms of electricity, let's get back to the basics. It is technically feasible to replace our coal power stations with nuclear, wind, and solar, and maybe a battery if Elon Musk figures it out one day. That is technically feasible, but how are you going to decarbonize the rest of the economy? I think that's fantasy, and that is what's being proposed at the moment. In terms of renewable energies, they are great. South Africa's got lots of sun; we need to use them, right? The wind, we've got wind; we need to use them, but it's not obvious to me that they are necessarily cheaper because they are intermittent. So what do you do when there's no sun and then there's no wind? You have to back it up, and usually that's where the natural gas guys come in and they say, well, we're going to sell you gas. And we saw this in Texas now. Well, actually the gas went out as well, but gas and wind didn't go out, and the gas guys were all smiling because the gas price shot through the roof.
But before we get to Texas, there is something else I want to touch on, and that is there's this nefarious, almost like imperialist prescriptiveness when it comes to Western countries pretty much dictating to the third world that they're not allowed to grow their economies in the same way that they did.
But this makes no sense to me, right? So the all industrialized countries, or all first world countries, went through an industrial revolution, which was essentially coal, steel, textiles, agriculture, etc., and to develop their economies, right? That's basic developmental economics. And now there's this theory that Africa can be the exception to the rule. So Africa must just leapfrog. We're going to give Africa renewables and wind and a high-tech economy, and they're just going to prosper. And they're not going to need factories or anything of the sort. That to me is the fantasy being promoted currently by the IMF and the World Bank for Africa. And what they're essentially saying to Africa is, you are not allowed to have access to the exact same technology that we had when we developed. I mean, you can see imperialism 101 being portrayed through carbon emissions. So they're telling Africa, I mean, Africa's problem is not its carbon footprint. Africa's problem is not having a carbon footprint. If Africa had a carbon footprint, it would be richer. So it's essentially telling Africa, you need to limit your carbon footprint as you develop your economy. This recipe has never been followed, not by China, not by India, because China and India is giving essentially a finger to the World Bank and the IMF. And it's telling, so it's telling Africa, you're going to take all the stuff which doesn't work anywhere else, and we're going to use it, and you're going to have to develop through it.
And this is something that's not called out quite that often. Everyone is cheering it on that this is the future, and everyone believes in this fairy tale that it is possible, as you said, for third world countries or for developing nations to pretty much just leapfrog and catch up with the rest of the world. But they are missing a key ingredient on that path to development, which is the industrialization phase, which is impossible under the current regulations. It's pretty much.
Well, if you take it, so this is where we spoke about this before the show started. The engineers have got a big issue, which is that we have this belief in the IT revolution. Bill Gates came out with Microsoft XP, and then it got XP 1, 2, 3, and it was all updated, right? So now we have Microsoft 2010, 2020, whatever we've got, and Windows 10, etc. So, we had successive softwares every few years because of Moore's law. Essentially, processors were getting so fast, and we thought that the world's going to change. But if you go to reality, which is the world of atoms, you realize your kitchen is the same as in 1950s. The only difference is there's a microwave, right? So what guarantees life? And usually there's 4 or high standard of living. Usually there's 5 networks. Telecommunications is one of 5 networks. What about sewage systems? Okay, I'm thankful for sewage systems, because if it wasn't for that, we'd have actual diseases that are far more dangerous than COVID-19, right? Thankful for chlorine in our water. So sewage is one of the systems. Electricity is another one, which South Africa doesn't have. When highways is another system, and then you have water, water into your house, basically clean water. So with those 5 systems, you essentially guarantee a high standard of living, basic infrastructure. Now, apart from the telecommunications network, the other 4 of them are more or less the same since the 1950s. And Africa needs to develop this first alongside the high-tech economy. I'm not against the high-tech economy, for us to have the same standard of living as the rest of Europe. So we're looking at one system, we're saying, they're going to leapfrog. We're just going to put a solar panel into a shack, and essentially the guy's going to have a high-tech computer, and everyone's going to be a computer coder. That
Just
does
learn
not
to code, bro.
just learn to code, bro. It doesn't add up. And if you take it, most of the work, even in the industrialized West today, is not in the high-tech sector. It's actually it's actually still people working with their hands. So those people need to be part of the economy, and that's, if you want to alienate them, okay. But let's do that. But at least let's sell it to them first. Let's tell them, you're not going to have a prosperous life. You all have to learn to code. I don't see how we're all going to work for Amazon or Facebook or Google. And that's going to be the only economy that Africa's got access to. I think that's a fantasy, frankly. And I think we're not having this discussion more often, where we're saying, what practical steps do we need before we can guarantee human flourishing and actual sustainability.
All right, but you're raising a very difficult and hard question there. What are those practical steps?
Well, the first thing is Africa needs electricity, right? Africa's got a big deficit in its electricity access. So we need either loans from the World Bank. First, we need a better credit rating, because we're not very good at paying back our loans. We need, regime reform, or the structural reforms in our economy, not a national democratic revolution, but actually getting rid of all the red tape, first of all, to allow businesses to come in. But if we look at what Africa lacks, I mean, it's the same. It's the things that Europe has got, essentially, right? It's those networks. So we need to have some way to find investment into infrastructure, and that the money doesn't go away. And essentially, Africa needs to increase its carbon footprint for it to have a prosperous lifestyle. Okay, we need to fight for the right to have a carbon footprint.
Now
If
you're
the
speaking like a heretic.
Yeah, I sound like one, but here's the hypocrisy, right? So Germany, the greenest of all European countries, I think Sweden is probably the greenest, but Germany's number 2, basically expanded its solar and its wind capacity, right? Massively through the Energiewende, energy transition. And Germany has added in the same period 10 megawatts of coal power stations. That's more than the entire Africa combined. So even in the most highly industrialized green economy of the world, that is not happening. You're not seeing the investment into the renewable energies that's been promised. Actually, German carbon emissions have gone up since they implemented their solar and their wind solutions for the future. So that's the if Germany is doing it, why can't we do it? That's the first question you need to ask. Then you can look at a country that did more sensibly, which was the United States. The United States had no carbon tax. And they managed to reduce their carbon emissions because they went over from coal to natural gas. And natural gas, it happens, emits less carbon emissions per kilogram or per ton, or however you measure it. That's the first thing. The other thing about this carbon emission stuff, it's a little bit of BS attached to it, because countries are told that they need to self-report carbon emissions. Now, I mean, China is going to be honest about it, right? India is going to be honest about it.
It's like that scenario where you're in school, in primary school, and the teacher tells you that you need to mark your friend's paper.
Yeah, no, you need to mark your own paper, and you need to be honest.
You need to mark your own paper. It's even worse.
And in pencil, something of this sort. So this is where the BS comes in. So what is this all based on? Let's get to the fact. So all religions, in my view, are based on some kind of fear. Existential fears. Okay, you're not going to go to heaven, you're going to go to hell, or whatever sort. In this case, the heaven is that we, in the year 2050 or the year 2100, we are going to reduce the world's carbon emissions. It's going to be net zero, and the planet is no longer going to warm. Okay, that's the act of faith. The act of faith is, if we make drastic cuts to our carbon emissions, by the year 2050, we're going to be on our way to a new ice age. So the idea is the global warming scare, I would call it. Now, let's look at the reality of global warming. It is true that carbon emissions have gone up since the 1950s, since after World War II. That's when most of the industrialization happened. But since the 1900s, the Earth has only warmed on average by 1 degree at surface temperatures. Satellite temperatures and the lower troposphere doesn't even show it. So 1 degree, for 1 degree, we've gotten a hell of a lot of human flourishing. I'm saying we can warm up the Earth a little bit more, Okay, probably.
Wait. So, firstly, you said Africa needs a larger carbon footprint, and now you're saying we need to actually make the Earth warmer.
Yes, we need to make the Earth warmer by another degree, because if I do this, it's 2 degrees, right?
I'm just waiting for you to start chanting carbon like Alex Jones when he went on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he just starts chanting carbon, carbon,
Well,
I'm
the,
pro
the the thing
carbon.
about increasing carbon dioxide is that the increase is logarithmic. So for every doubling of carbon dioxide, you get 1 degree. Now, what the global warming's fearmongers assume is that the increase of carbon dioxide is going to create warmer air, and that's going to increase the water vapor in the air. And it's actually water vapor that's the biggest greenhouse gas. Now, I'm saying bring it, baby, because my view is that more places like Venice would be amazing. It'd be great if Cape Town is a little bit underwater. I don't like Cape Town anyways, but the reality is you can adapt to a warmer climate. Man is adaptable, right? So they've got the hypothesis of a stupid farmer, which is essentially if the climate increases, we're gonna still plant the crops that don't make any profit. I mean,
Yeah, but hasn't the world gotten greener with this increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
yeah, in the last 20 years, the world has gotten green, and that's measurable by NASA satellites if they want to check that up. Now, there are people that say we must be careful because we're going to reach saturation. We're going to have so much warming that the plants cannot absorb all the CO2. Well, that hasn't happened yet. And this is where I say the science becomes prophecy. So I'm very skeptical of predictions of the future because nobody has the ability to predict the future. Okay, it's probably if somebody tells me the sun or the Earth is going to go around the sun next year, I'm definitely going to believe him because that's a verifiable fact. It might be that another galaxy collides with our galaxy and the sun shoots out somewhere else, and we would probably won't be here to observe it because we'll die. But generally, that's a good assumption. That's a good prediction of the future. It's a good prediction to say for the next 100,000 years, the Earth is going to go around the sun. That's very good. But as soon as you're dealing with complexity like a climate, which contains the orbital variations of the Earth, it contains solar radiation from the sun, it contains the Pacific oscillations. It has lots and lots of complex factors. And you're saying, based on all these factors, I've got a computer model that is going to predict what the temperature at the surface is going to be on average, which is meaningless metric anyways, in the year 2050 or 2100. I think you're dealing with prophecy. You're not dealing with scientific predictions anymore. It's sort of like the economist telling me that we're going to hit the next recession. When is it going to be? We don't know. So I don't buy doom and gloom stories. And the other reason is everywhere when you look behind you, okay, you're seeing life expectancy has gone up in every country in the world. You're seeing more standards of living. You're seeing the greening of the earth. You're seeing more agricultural yield. We've got more food than ever before. You're seeing improvement everywhere except for crime in South Africa. But generally, all statistics point in a positive direction. And so my argument to them is, on what basis do we say the future is going to be worse than the past if only thing we see in front of behind us is progress?
Well, you mentioned something there that I find very eerie. Firstly, it's the eerie resemblance between these climate prophets and doomsday prophets making all these predictions. A lot of people, a surprising amount of people, believe them, and then it doesn't happen, and then they change their predictions. But there's something else a bit more disturbing there. That's the fact that, we've all seen Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth. I think it was like mandatory viewing in a lot of primary schools back in the day. And my question there is something that's very disturbing is that there were all these predictions like
the ice ages, the polar ice caps were supposed to disappear 5 years ago.
Yeah, and Kilimanjaro was never going to have snow again by 2050, and all these like very concerning predictions. And the predictions weren't like in 2050 or in 2030. The predictions were in 2012, in 2015, in 2018. All those years came and gone, but none of it happened and nothing materialized. But the disturbing part is that all those predictions have just been memory hold.
Well, there's a very interesting
Gone.
website called Extinction Clock, which shows you all the extinction predictions of the climate. And that ice age that my father was taught in the 1970s, that is supposed to happen in July this year. So we can actually verify if the ice age is coming or not. By July this year, more or less, we should be in an ice age. Look, predicting the future for complex phenomena is, I just don't buy it. I don't buy that you can really do so. I believe, though, you can take a climate model, which is a very sophisticated computer model, and you can understand the climate and the problems related to it, and you can probably project 5 years into the future. I would buy that. But to tell me what the temperature is going to be in 2050 or 2100, I find that to be a prophecy. And it's as if Nostradamus learned calculus, basically.
Well, you mentioned Germany, and I mean, I remember it was big in the news when Germany embarked on their green revolution, and everything's going to be solar and wind powered. They're going to lead the way. They're going to be the pioneers. And as you explained, it hasn't gone as planned. But you mentioned when we were talking in private, you mentioned Spain also going on a similar venture and not picking the fruits
Yeah,
that
there's a
they.
Spanish, I forget, let me get the name of the company. There's a Spanish energy company that just went bankrupt. And this is the other thing about these projections. So again, with renewable energy, my advice to people is I'm not saying don't go for it. I mean, by all means, South Africa, you probably don't have a choice. If you have a Dojo tank, renewables is nice to pump the bore wall and fill it up.
Mhm.
But be very careful of salesmen. I used to be a hardware salesman. Okay, that's my first job when I was studying to be an engineer. And you always used to give a client 5 upsides and 1 downside. And one downside was to make it look a little bit realistic because you don't want to be too overconfident. And this is sort of what I'm getting from the renewable energy guys, is that it's only good projections. It's in the last 10 years the prices have crashed. And then you ask them, okay, let's evaluate these policies on a cost per cost basis. Let's see what they actually costed. And interesting enough, in the UK, when they cut the subsidies for wind a little bit, they saw no more new investment in wind energy, and they realized electricity prices have gone up. Electricity prices have gone up in Germany and in California. Okay, this is why there's energy poverty. Now, in South Africa, we happen to have more sun than Germany, so maybe that can work, right? You have to get an economist and somebody, an electrical engineer, and somebody that actually knows what they're talking about to evaluate these massive infrastructure projects and to say to you, okay, look, based on this and this and this, we've done our calculations and we're going to pilot a few of them. And after we've piloted a few of them, let's see maybe if we should embark on a massive industrial process to change the entire country's energy system. But the Germans skipped that phase. They just said we're going to go balls against the walls and we're going to do it. And as you see, the Germans now actually have to buy nuclear energy from France. So we're in a very good position because when the sun isn't shining, the French are selling them nuclear energy at a very cheap tariff. In Spain, there was a big Spanish company, the biggest electric energy company, that just went bankrupt. And I forgot the name now for some reason. But anyway, so they went bankrupt this year. Okay, but if you look at the media, everyone is telling you renewables have fallen in prices, and I'm just saying I'm looking at this stuff and I'm hearing stuff from the inside of the industry telling me let's be a little bit more careful. And I'm seeing all the natural gas guys smiling because they know when it's not working, the cheapest and the easiest thing to start up is a natural gas methane plant.
Mm. You mentioned France, and you are residing in France, so you have first-hand knowledge. How is France's strategy in regards to energy contrasted with Germany and Spain, for example?
So France is 58 nuclear reactors. So they are going to upgrade them now for another 20 years extension. And during this whole cold winter, our electricity prices went up by something like 8%. You wouldn't have noticed it, right, if I didn't tell you. Um, Contrast that with Germany and with the United States, especially Texas, and with the UK, electricity prices shot up into the stratosphere over there. Because the intermittency from both gas and from renewables is supposed to be a problem. In Germany, you saw solar panels full of snow. So they don't work when there's snow on top of them. So what do you have to do in that situation? And this is what a lot of people are worried about, is they're saying, if we have a grid running on intermittency, what happens during a disaster? What if you've got a hospital running on it, even if there's a battery to back it up, and we have a big freeze like we've got at the moment? How do you get power to that hospital very quickly? And this is where the stuff goes from being a joke to being serious, where you say you don't have the power anymore. And what I think is slowly happening worldwide, and we're probably going to see this with the COPE, the next IPCC report that's coming out this year. The world is waking up to the reality that if you want to decarbonize your energy grid, you need to go for nuclear power. Because nuclear, believe it or not, does not emit carbon emissions. It's a very safe energy solution. And I might have employment in the future if we go for nuclear energy. So I'm actually a salesman for it.
That's exactly what's going on here. Yeah, you mentioned the solar panels being covered in snow, but it's not just the solar panels. As we saw this year in Texas, the wind turbines also don't like the snow all that much. It actually is quite catastrophic in regards to the
Just
effect.
give me 1 second. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, that's
Um,
fine. Yeah, so you're right.
what
It's
happened there?
well, Texas had 2 problems. First of all, it was the natural gas and the wind. Right? So both of them proved not to be resilient to the weather. So the wind, one day it was only the wind didn't blow. The wind turbines was frozen, and there was a nice photo of a helicopter going around, spraying water or something onto it to try to get it to turn
A
around.
helicopter using carbon fuel.
Yes, so a helicopter using kerosene, whatever it uses, some kind of oil. Anyway, so the helicopter was running around trying to save the wind turbine. Okay, and that's now all over the media. But the guys telling you that are selling you gas. The natural gas guys are not being honest either, because the gas froze in the wells, because in Texas they had no backup. Now this is the conversation that's now going to happen, is we've got this renewable energy, the wind blows very nicely, and then we're all smiling and all the cameras are there and saying just prices have never been cheaper, they're negative. When it doesn't work, the natural gas guys are slowly smiling and they're saying we're going to pump gas up, which emits methane, by the way, which is carbon, but we don't talk about that. And basically the wind and the natural gas works in sync, because we know to have batteries at the moment is too expensive, and in the batteries we don't even know how weatherized they are. So what happens when you have a crisis? Well, it seems in this crisis that integrated solution didn't work. And the reason is they didn't have a backup capacity. Now, if you have the backup of all the gas and you need to factor that risk into your pricing model, what is your electricity going to do then? Is it going to increase? Is it going to decrease? Well, it's obviously going to increase. Who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be the grid? Is it going to be the grid operator? Is it going to be a renewable operator? Is it going to be the gas operator? At the end of the day, it's going to be the consumer. Doesn't matter how they factor it, they're going to pass that price on to the consumer. Now, my argument is, given the extra risk due to extreme weather events, ironically snow when we're trying to save the world from global warming, is renewable still cheaper? Is gas still cheaper? And this is, I think, where the nuclear guys are starting to smile now and saying, wait a minute, we've got a solution that was working most of the time. We're going to win the race. So there's a lot of this type of politics in the energy sector. I must say also the nuclear guys are not always too honest, because they don't always talk about decommissioning costs, etc., etc. But generally, if you have a nuclear power station, you're supposed to factor in decommissioning into your pricing model. So Kuberg, for example, has a decommissioning fund. Hopefully the government didn't steal the money. I mean, this is South Africa. They would never do such a thing. But I hope that our decommissioning fund is well invested and it's generating money for the time when Kuberg needs to be decommissioned. And we should probably check out Nexa for that. But, so Germany has had the same problem. They also blew the money a little bit. So yeah, anyways, the point about the energy sector is nobody's giving you a fully honest review of their product. And I think the guys who all know us is the fossil fuel guys, because there used to be a joke in the fossil fuel industry. They say if you take a Democrat's argument for renewable energy and you change the word renewable for nuclear, you've got a Republican's argument for nuclear energy. And the fossil fuel guys are really happy about it. So I don't know where this energy sector thing is going to go. But the thing is, a lot of it is being pushed by the global warming fear. And this is why I say the religion comes into play. They're scared of burning carbon dioxide, and they're saying we need to reduce our emissions, and we need to find a solution for it. And that's just now where they're talking about energy transition.
Yeah, your original sin was being born a carbon-based life form in this religion,
yeah.
pretty much.
Humans, I think every day you release about 4 pounds of carbon dioxide, something of the sort. There's some interesting statistic. And if you take a human's breath to a coal power plant's breath, a coal power plant, I think it's got 20% carbon dioxide. We've got 4%. Okay, so we are, if you've got 4 humans, you've got the equivalent of a coal power plant proportion to its breath. Anyway, so that's the energy sector. The energy sector is talking about decarbonization. It is the new paradigm. It's a new big thing running all the way from Davos to the Green New Deal, the European Union. But again, my question is, energy is a small percentage of all the carbon emissions. The majority of it comes from buildings. How are you going to do that? How are you going to stop building cement? How are you going to do steel? Right? I can see sort of the plausibility of saying we're going to move away from coal and natural gas and get all these wonderful things. But how are you going to fly aeroplanes?
See, that's the devil in the details. When you actually bother to go into some of these things like the Green New Deal and a lot of these climate projections, then you quickly realize that the only solution, according to them, is not to only have a carbon zero footprint, but to have a negative carbon footprint. That's the only way we survive, according to these prophets.
Well, if they want to do that, we can plant a lot of trees, right? We can sequestrate carbon in the topsoil. There's farm. By the way, the other guys jumping onto this bandwagon is farmers, because every farmer is now trying to be sustainable. Now, my question is sustainable agriculture. Okay, it looks very nice, and you've got all these crops and these beautiful green fields, and then they've all got solar panels and wind, and it looks wonderful. What is your labor cost? Is the cost of food going to be more expensive? Right? What about these things? And when you ask the farmers that, well, many of them will get subsidies from the government. So at the end of the day, the government is subsidizing them for an inefficient business model. It's the same thing that they have with ethanol-based fuel, which is biofuels. Basically, you plant corn and you make fuel out of it. First of all, it's diesel you're burning. It releases kerosene, which is the same thing you get from burning plastic, so it's carcinogenic. But what happened in Germany, for example, is they said to the farmers, "Well, we want to produce biofuel because it's too dangerous to get the fuel out of the ground." So they had the idea that a few farmers are going to produce biofuel, but they gave subsidies to farmers. And before you knew it, all the farmers were doing this. And now the Germans have to import food from the Netherlands, and the Dutch were always smiling because they knew that they were actually encouraging the Germans to try this experiment. I mean, who would have thought of that, right? So you
Yeah,
find the law of unintended consequences all over this thing.
the swamp Germans win again.
Yeah,
Um,
so they shot themselves in their own foot. But anyway, so all these policies running from the Great Reset at Davos is essentially telling you in everything you do, you're now going to think about carbon, like how they want you to think about systemic racism and everything. Now it's carbon dioxide. So this is the second addition to the religion. You know, the moral feel good is about your carbon footprint. Um, but I mean, I just look at the plausibility of a lot of these things, and I think it's complete absurdity. Okay, to think that you're going to do it. Interesting enough, in 1998, we had the Kyoto Protocol for the UN, which tried to get countries to limit their carbon emissions. Didn't work. The Paris Agreement in 2016 tried something similar, which is a bigger joke of an agreement. Now, if you look at carbon emissions by country, you will see most European countries peaked in the 1990s already, before the Kyoto Protocol, before the Paris Agreement. Okay, so they've slowly been on a gradual decrease because they got more efficient at using their fuels. Um, so you find that all these big international agreements and great resets, etc., they seem to have absolutely no effect as to what people do on the ground. And I'm not surprised at that. The Paris Agreement, for example, tells countries that they need to self-report their emissions and they need to set their own goals. Now, the interesting one to me is the country that's meeting all of its goals is Russia, because it didn't set any goals. That's a way of, of achieving.
that's how you beat it.
That's how you beat the system.
Yeah. Before we continue, I'm going to pay some attention to chat here. There was an interesting comment that caught my eye from Harald Ratsdorf, who says Sweden tried to go more green and turned off their nuclear power plants. That caused problems this winter. Are you aware of this, Hugo?
Well, I'm aware of the winter outages. I'm not aware of the Swedish in particular. But one thing about Sweden is I know they passed a carbon tax in the 90s and they did it on electricity, but it was purely symbolic because the electricity came mostly from nuclear. Okay, so you find a lot of this virtue signaling in being green, and I won't be surprised if the Swedes are part of this nonsense. A lot of this rubbish come from Scandinavian countries as well, by the way. The Brundtland Commission in the 1980s was another thing on sustainable development. That's another thing they're trying to push, sustainable development. Now, the idea of sustainable development is that you've got this circular economy, so you're going to reuse every project. Every product that you do. It happens to be that the most sensible, most economically viable thing for plastics, for example, is to either incinerate it or put it in a landfill. Plastic recycling, wherever it's been tried, is a failure. When they tried plastic recycling in Europe, they couldn't do it at an economically viable thing, so they just shipped their plastics to China, and the Chinese put it in the oceans. Okay, so Europeans are clean. They're recycling their plastics because they remove the problem. So you find these type of stupidities all written all over these green policies. Yeah, but I don't know in particular about the Swedish case. No.
There was another question here for you, Ihu. Variable Vision asks, Ihu, do you see a future for decentralized nuclear energy generation technologies like pebble bed and modular reactors?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. So pebble bed, I spoke to Dr. Calvin Kim, who was the former head of Nexa on my YouTube channel, and they want to try and restart the pebble bed in South Africa. Okay, the pebble bed was a remarkable technology for its time. It's still good, but they needed funding for it. How much it's going to cost, etc., I don't know. But it is open for investment. Investors can look into it. So the advantage of the pebble bed was a thorium reactor. So you had those nice thorium balls we had, and it was helium modulated. So you had helium around it. The reason is it was developed for Africa. You cannot do anything with those pebble bed balls, essentially. They're useless except if you use them for fuel. So you don't have to worry if somebody steals the truck and hijacks it at night, etc. It was designed for African problems. The advantage of it was that you could take a pebble bed and you can put it next to a mine, for example, and it can give power to a mine. Then you don't need a coal mine to power the mine. You've got a small pebble bed reactor. The helium itself had some engineering challenges, but my understanding is they could recover it. So what they're now talking about is small modular reactors, SMRs. There's a big thing in Canada. Ironically, South Africans working on the project as well, which they call the nuke scale project. No, it's not nuke scale. It is Moltex. Sorry, molten salt reactors, which was developed in the United States at Oak Ridge Laboratory. And molten salt is also a thorium-based reactor. So the advantages of thorium, you usually cannot make nuclear weapons. Nuke scale is making just a smaller pressure water reactor. And the US department, NASA, for example, is sending a nuclear power plant to Mars, I think it's to a Mars mission or a moon mission of some sort. Not the solar panel, by the way. So there is lots of development happening in SMRs. The problem is with SMRs, it is at a tier level where private investors, are still a little bit skeptical if they should put money into it. They don't know if I should jump yet or not because it hasn't been tried yet, right? And that is where the next phase of nuclear's got the issue at the moment. They would like a little bit of risky investments to say, look, we sort of have the thing working on paper now. We more or less know how to do it, but let's go build it. And understanding as you build it, you're probably going to make a bit of mistakes, going to go over budget, and then you need to have a long-term commitment to try and get the cost down. And that's where nuclear is at the moment. So I'm actually hopeful that they will have decentralized nuclear power. Of course, waste management will be an issue. You need to manage it properly. It can be done. It's just a question of how do you manage it. Do you want to trust every tin pot dictator with a pressure water reactor that also makes enriched uranium in the process? No, I probably don't want to do that. But if it's a thorium reactor like the Pebble Bed, yeah, we can use it throughout Africa.
We've actually got two more comments regarding the pebble bed question. And this comes from Sideliner Opinions, who says pebble bed is the logical conclusion. Too much heat created was their problem. And there's a second comment. They must use the extra heat for steam generators, which requires water.
Yeah, they had some issues with it. Look, the big issue they had, to my understanding, was the helium. Helium is it's the second item on the periodic table, right? It's a very small gas, and it was very difficult to keep it confined. And that had to do with the heat being generated. But the idea was that they could use the pebble bed and you can use it to make heat for industrial processes. So essentially, you put a water pipe or some compound material next to it that can conduct heat, and that can be used for your factories. So they had very big plans for it. Um, it never really got past the testing phase, to my understanding, and they didn't even build the proper thing. They only tested some parts of it, but it was a very good project for South Africa. And had the ANC not taken the funding away from it at the time, South Africa now could have been the leaders in SMR technology. We could have sold the pebble beds to the whole world, and we can tell them, look, we've got a solution that's practical for decarbonization.
Made in Africa.
Made in Africa, right? And you find the pebble bed technology that is being developed in the United States, they just called it another name, it's South African engineers working in it. So they took our technology to the US and they're trying to sell it there. But a lot of these projects in nuclear, and this is unfortunately the issue with nuclear, it only stays on paper. It never gets to the point where it's built. And with all the talks of thorium, molten salt reactors, other types of nuclear reactors, the most practical one for building at the moment still remains the good old pressure water reactor, which Kubrick has got. And there's only a few countries that really can build them, which is the French, the South Koreans, the Russians, the Americans with Westinghouse, although they had financial issues with that as well. So you find you need very big government backing for it. And the other thing is you need politicians, and this is what South Africa doesn't have, with a long-term vision. Because when you build a nuclear power station, it's for 60 years. Now, you cannot have a greenie coming around in 5 years saying, guys, we need to shut down the power station, because then you lose all the money you put into it. So unless a country has a long-term industrialization plan, those things remain a fantasy.
Well, it is quite interesting to know that South Africans out there are still selling or trying to make a reality out of these concepts and this new form of energy, or this new form of way of generating nuclear energy. But at the same time, there was something else. Seeing as we already only have 10 minutes about left. Something else I wanted to get to, you actually suggested it as a topic, and that was city planning and urban sprawl. So if you could give us a little introduction there, and then we can take it.
So this, I should have actually started with this. This is how I got into the whole green thing. I work with on part-time basis with an American named Joel Kotkin, who's got his own podcast, by the way, and he wrote a book recently called Neo-Feudalism: A Warning to the Middle Class. And the argument he puts forth is that city planners worldwide have got a vision, and really a vision of reducing urban sprawl. And it's inspired by a woman with the name of Jane Jacobs that wrote a book in the 1970s that essentially said, look, we are building suburbia all over the place and we're killing the life of cities. So she had the vision of her head, to make it simple, that basically we need to revive what Paris is and what London is and what New York is, walkable cities, for example. You see everyone talking about this 15-minute cities, Paris. The problem with this theory is, again, it's a theory that has to be tested against the facts, is that the economy since the 1950s, or even a little bit before that, developed around the automobile. So we all have cars driving around from work. And how does that fit into the vision where everything is walkable? How does that fit into the vision or how does that vision fit into the reality that many of the new companies that started in garages, for example? Apple is a good example of that, right? So this was in suburbia. So the point is that city planners worldwide, and it's driven by environmentalism, have the idea that they need to limit the amount of space that people have because they have this theory in their head that urban sprawl is bad. It increases the cost of services. It's not always true. Okay, it's true in some cases, but like anything in the world, if you oversimplify it, you see the rise of incompetency. So California, for example, cannot have a railway because of its geography. It's got highways everywhere. California is a very rich economy. So when people tell you that urban sprawl is destroying the economy, they're talking nonsense because California is the richest state in America, developed around suburbia. So is Texas. So you find that city planners, and Cape Town is doing this particularly, they're trying to limit the amount of space and they're trying to increase the floor space ratio. So they're trying to build apartments everywhere. And they want us all to stay into this. So they promote this vision. But if you look at the data where people are moving to, in South Africa, one of the fastest growing cities is Ballito. It's St. Francis. It is not Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Cape Town anymore. Or in Pretoria, it's in the eastern side, which is sprawling. So you find people move to sprawling areas, and yet the city planners are trying to stop us from sprawling. And the argument is that it's going to increase damage to the environment. Now, even on their own arguments, I'm not convinced because cities themselves have what we call the urban heat island effect. Essentially, the denser you are, the more energy you use per square meter. And if you've got suburbia, the energy is dispersed. So even if you want to stop the heating, it makes more sense for me to spread people out. But the point is, people prefer to live in suburbia, especially when they have families, because they want a house and a garden, etc. Some people obviously want to live in apartments, and you need to have both visions for your city. But planners are being trained that sprawl is bad because it's going to increase municipal cost, etc., etc. It's a very oversimplification of everything.
Yeah, well, it's living in a city myself and coming from a small town, I know exactly what you're talking about when it comes to which is the better option in regards to where you want to live. But
But I mean, I've got statistics which are interesting that said that Shanghai, for example, contrary to popular belief, is less dense now than it was in the 1980s. Because in communist houses, they put everyone in apartments, basically. It's just as people migrated to the city, that what we call the city got bigger. It's the same true of Paris. Paris was more dense in the 1600s than it is today. Okay, so but the area you call Paris was very small. It was the Petite Couronne. But so cities sprawl naturally. Now, planners have the idea they're trying to limit sprawl, but I think what is really happening is they're price fixing houses. And there's a very big correlation between policies aiming to fight urban sprawl, essentially limit land, and increasing house prices. Now, you ask yourself, if you're the average young Californian or a New Yorker, how are you going to afford a house? When you're in your 20s or 30s, whenever you want to buy a house and you want to settle down and have a family in your own city, most of them can't. So you find some of the fastest growing cities in the world is in St. Louis, for example, in America. Okay, it's in South Carolina. Florida has got Atlanta's got it's a very big growing area. A lot of the shift in states from red to blue happened because of the migration from New York and California to the heartland. Now, ironically, the people are walking away from policies that chase them away, and then they vote the same stupid policies into place.
Like a swarm of leftist locusts.
Yeah, and somebody here said humans are not made to live like rats. Well, I agree with that. I mean, in Paris, yeah, I've got a 2-bedroom apartment, and my rent is more than my parents pay for a 6-bedroom house in South Africa. Okay, what do you want to choose if you've got the option? So, okay, in Europe, you've got less space maybe, but even around Paris, there's lots of space still to develop. So the environmentalists don't want us to exploit the land around us because they want to protect the environment, and they're saying it's increasing services, etc. And I don't believe it's true, to be honest. I think the data is mixed. But the point is, if people want to live in in suburbia, you need to give them what they want. And the world, if anything, is not overpopulated. This is the idea I want people to get out of there. The world is underpopulated. If you take one of the most densely populated places in the world, it's the Netherlands. It's a very rich place. If you take one of the most sparsely populated places in the world, it's Chad. It's a poor place. So it's a very good argument to say the more dense the city, the more people you've got, the more economic prosperity you will have. Anyway, so yeah, I make the point just that suburbia versus what we I wrote an article to Colette soon recently, which said it's basically about migration, and the argument I put forth is that there's a coming battle between the city and the countryside, and what we call the urbanistas, the green ideologues, and the basically the New York property estates and the tech oligarchs, etc. They want to live like Paris and New York and California. The problem is most of the people worldwide cannot afford that, and they don't want to live like that. They want to live in suburbia. And you can see this tension running through US politics. I mean, it's essentially what they're voting on. And you can see it happening in France as well. The 10 top places in France for migration is Aix-en-Provence, Bordeaux, Toulouse. Paris is not in the top 10 list of where French people want to stay. So you find that politicians have got this vision to create the 15-minute city and the walkable city and everything, but yet people are walking away from it. So I'm saying if your vision conflicts with the data, you need to follow the data.
Well, this depopulation of urban cities has been something I've been noticing as well for a couple of years now, and not by looking at the data, but by looking at the zeitgeist. You're seeing an increasing amount of people saying pretty much, leave the cities, it's so much better. Look at all these pictures of my huge plot of land that I'm living on for so cheap. Look at my clean neighborhood. Look at all the space that I have. Look at all this clean air that I have. And it's catching on. A lot of people, it's no longer just a little bit of a fringe group of people saying, leave the cities, come live in these small towns. You can do it. You can work from home, especially now with the coronavirus, pretty much exposing how we already have the tech to work from home. We've just hadn't had the opportunity to really popularize it among the populace, but now it has been. A lot of people are realizing I don't have to go live in a small apartment in the city for a job. I can go live in a small little town and still do that job that I would have done in the city. There's this excellent cartoon about city life. There's this city tree, and standing there in the middle of the city, like on a sidewalk, and it says, everything is dirty. The air I breathe is literal cigarettes, but at least the restaurants are nice.
Well, exactly. And somebody in the comments just mentioned smart cities. That is what they're calling it. Smart cities is the walkable city. Now, by all means, I love the trains in Paris. Okay, I love the fact that I don't have to drive a car at the moment. But it's not realistic for most people. This is the point we do. I mean, life is about trade-offs. It's not about perfection, right? And if you can now, as you say, work from home, I mean, I was seriously considering during this pandemic to buy a house in the countryside, which costs less than a house in South Africa. It's much bigger in the French countryside. I went home to South Africa, and this is now where it's going to get interesting. I went home to Polokwane, or Pietersburg, as we should call it. And in Pietersburg, for example, I could work, and I was running conference calls between Russia and New York and Paris from a space in Petersburg. The only problem is the Wi-Fi is bad and there was load shedding, so I had to cancel the conference halfway through. But if those problems are overcome, why do I want to stay in Johannesburg? Why do I want to stay in Pretoria? Now, I want to give you interesting statistics here. The fastest growing places in South Africa, where people are making their former holiday home, the places of work, is Ballito, Knysna, St. Francis Bay, Port Alfred, and Jeffreys Bay. And this trend is now known as semigration. Nobody would tell you that.
You just limit your time at a beautiful place next to the beach only to December? Why don't you just live there? I mean, it's such a no-brainer.
Well, this is coming, and where people move, the ideas move with them, and the work will go. And there's the other thing you need to take into account about cities is, and this is when I got into city planning now, take it seriously. A city depends on a certain demographic. It is not the ultra young, as we are told. Okay, we always told you need people in your 20s. But people in your 20s are dispensable. You can easily fire them because they don't have life experience, and they tend to live in apartments and they're on and off in jobs. The people you want to keep if you want to make your city a vibrant place is the people in their 30s and their 40s. And those are the people that are settling down and have kids and family. And despite all this talk about people are working part-time, etc., most people still want a job for 5 to 10 to 15 years, right? Especially people who work with their hands. They still want to settle down because if you have kids in your school, you don't want to change your jobs every 2 years. And those are the people that carry a city forward. and you tend to find them in suburbia. So you find the places in America that's growing the fastest is Houston in Texas. Houston, by the way, has got absolutely no city planning rules. It's amazing. You can build whatever you want. It sometimes get a little bit out of hand. Um, is Florida, in Atlanta, Georgia. If you take the top 10 counties in America where Black Americans are doing the best, it's all in the former deep South, right? And it's all places that are semi-suburban. So my advice to anyone that is young as well as to say, why would I want to work in the future is I say, find a place you like and see what the demographics look like. And the other thing that we need to take into account now is the recent violence we've seen. Violence are overwhelmingly in cities. There are some places in America, some cities that have not recovered from the riots in the 1960s, never mind the recent Black Lives Matter riots. So all those things will play a role, and those businesses will close, the people will migrate, and unfortunately you find urban slums. And nobody wants to say in an urban slum. It also happens to be that crime rates are very high in densely populated cities when there's no policing around, and that's Johannesburg especially. I see they only have one fire truck as well. Why do you want to stay in a place like that?
Yeah, just for context for our international listeners, Johannesburg, which has a population of nearly 6 million people, report this week revealed that the city only has one working fire truck. So
But
that's
he's working very hard. Okay, the guy's
yes,
running up and
he's
down.
earning his wage. Every morning that fire truck gets up and he knows he's making a difference.
Exactly.
So yeah, Hugo, maybe just a last thing, a little story when you mentioned these city planning and like building regulations and stuff. I was once driving through a small town, or not a small town, but one of these beach towns in the Western Cape, and I saw a house, a two-story house that was on stilts, like the roof was on stilts and the house was missing. And I asked someone there what's going on here, and they said, well, this house was built before the new building regulations came in about how high you're allowed to build your house. And they wanted to rebuild the house a little bit, but if they tore it down, they couldn't build it as high as it was. So they literally put the roof on stilts, demolished the entire house, and rebuilt it under it.
Well, my favorite one was when I went to Tanzania. They had as you go into from Dar es Salaam airport, you see there's no roofs everywhere. And you ask the guy, I think, yes, there's a construction site. What's happening? This city is exploding. You asked them, what's the story? And they said, no. They had a law at one stage where you get taxed only if your roof is done. So the guys didn't finish the roof, so you don't have to pay taxes. So
You have to game the system.
you have to game the system. So you find this with building regulations. Look, also construction companies know how to work around planners. Ironically, despite city planners wanting to fight urban sprawl, it has been happening. Okay, and it's happening faster than they're trying to fight it. So I think it must be a very demoralizing job to be a city planner because nobody's following your vision, right? You're telling them what to do, and then you find they build something else. If you take Pretoria, for example, everything east of the Handstrijl was built semi-illegally, cash under the table, Silver Lakes, all those areas. They was built, and then we said, oh, we just found these structures, and now we need to include them, right? And this is what you find with a lot of this stuff. So I'm actually not worried that planners have got as much power, but it's annoying because they've got this vision and they're selling it to everyone. And I think it's all part of the green religion. I think all of these are collective series of policies, which is limit your carbon footprint, put people in smart cities, drive an electric car, which is something else which is ridiculous if you look at long distance traveling. So there's a collective series of policies that are being pushed by governments worldwide in the West. It is going to be damaging, but if you then look at what people are actually doing, you find the complete opposite. And this is going to be a very interesting thing until there comes a politician along that's going to say, look, these policies you're promoting are not popular with people. We're just going to turn our back on them. And I think it's already happening, but it will take some time before the reality settles in.
Well, this has been a very enlightening chat, very much top notch, just like the first time, and I'm definitely going to have you on again in the future. So maybe just to sum it up, you heard it here first. According to Hügo Krüger, Africa needs a larger carbon footprint.
Yes.
We need to heat the earth, and the earth is underpopulated.
Earth is underpopulated. We need to heat the earth. We need a bigger carbon footprint. We need to rev our cars, and it will be amazing if Cape Town looks like Venice. If Cape Town looks like Venice, I might consider moving there. Otherwise, I'm not going there.
Every property is beachfront property. Anyway, thank you very much, Hügo. Enlightening conversation. And also, anyone, if you listened and you liked what Hügo had to say and you thought it was interesting, there's a link to his YouTube channel in the description. You can also go follow him on Twitter. Very interesting guy, shares a lot of interesting information. And then also, thank you very much to everyone that joined the chat tonight, that tuned in. And I see we just got a super chat here at the very end. Nick Miller says, "Ish, I'm gonna move to a container." Well,
Yes.
stranger things have happened, but don't call it a container. Well, you call it a container home in America. That's a migrant overflow facility. But anyway, so cheers, guys. Have a good one. You can also, if you're new to this channel and you like this type of conversation, you can subscribe. Also, share it on social media if you think people might find it interesting, and leave a like to help out the show. So, cheers, guys. Have a good one. Hugo, I hope you have an excellent evening, and I'll check you again on the next one. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.